Now you know me. I'm a connoisseur of horror games and I do love me a good scare every now and then. I've been round the block, I've seen some stuff, and some of that stuff has stayed with me even to this day by having such an impact on me, or hasn't stayed with me at all because it was unimpressive. I'm glad to say that Outlast 1 was a game that stayed with me for all the right reasons. Many have cited the first one as being the single most terrifying horror game of all time, as well as being the greatest horror game of all time. And though I personally don't agree with that statement, as I can name a few games off the top of my head that I felt were far scarier and better designed than Outlast 1 was, what I will say, however, is that if I was to put together a modern top 10 scariest game list ever, and combine all three of the videos that I've made, then Outlast would probably find itself around the number 5, maybe 4 mark. Outlast 1 did a lot of things right, and in such a manner that seems to suggest that the devs knew what they were doing when it came to designing this game. It felt as if this was a horror game designed by horror fans, for horror fans, in horror fans, and that last part doesn't make sense. In this game, you are thrown into an insane asylum with the intention of documenting a terrible tragedy that happened there a while back. But upon arriving there, you find that the place is still in use, and now all manner of deformed former inmates roam the place looking for something fleshy to play with, in the same way you play with a cheese string when you take it out the wrapper. You know, you start tearing it down the middle and then nibbling on the bottom part before working your way up to... Sorry, what were we talking about? And when the time came to face off against one of these inmates, you'll have to employ the famous tactics that Sir Robin used to use and bravely run away. Yeah, this is one of those games that doesn't give you any weapons, so your only 3 options in any hostile situation are run, hide, or die. You occasionally come across some puzzles, such as finding a missing item that's preventing you from overcoming an obstacle, but for the most part, you'll either be scanning the place for enemies, or running away from enemies. What I liked about the first game is that you can strategize how you get past a group of enemies. Though this is a single-player survival horror, and naturally it's very linear, each hostile area is also large enough for you to be able to move from hiding place to hiding place, mark off safe zones, find vantage points to observe the enemy's behaviour, and so on and so forth. It means by gathering all of this information, you can plot the best route around the enemy, as well as the timing for such an undertaking. Another thing worthy of note is the atmosphere, which is partly in thanks to the camcorder that you carry with you, and is your only source of light. Its main purpose is to see in the dark thanks to its night vision function, turning this game into essentially the Blair Witch Project if it was set in a funny farm that was run by Hannibal Lecter. And enemies don't necessarily attack you on sight. Sometimes you'll turn a corner, only to find one of them just standing there staring at you, making you wonder if they're hostile or not. We're so used to hostile enemies attacking us the moment we home into view, and naturally presume that characters who don't immediately attack us are friendly NPCs. Not so in Outlast. Some of them will just stand in plain sight and watch what you do for a while, waiting for you to turn your back on them, and only then will they attack. It's something that I don't think is done often in horror games, and as such, it makes the player feel incredibly vulnerable. The fact is that the old school rules that we've learnt from previous survival horror games don't seem to apply here, and because we can't fall back on the tried and true formula, we're forced to become very suspicious of everything, as well as being forced to constantly have our guard up. Naturally, the first game did really well, but this video isn't about that game, because hey presto, a sequel came out. And sort of in the same way as Mass Effect Andromeda, though nowhere near that level of shittiness, Outlast 2 was rated lower than we all thought it'd be. It still was received well, but is seen to be not as good as the original. To give you an idea, Outlast 1 is seen to be an absolutely fantastic horror game. In contrast, Outlast 2 is seen to be a good horror game. So something's happened here, and it's all up to True Review to figure out what's going on. Okay, I'll tell you what's happened here. And I can't believe I'm going to say this, considering that Outlast 1 and 2 were by the same people. Shock horror, I know. What seems to me is that Outlast 2 doesn't know how to be consistent. Sure, the horror is pretty much non-stop, but it seems to do itself a disservice at so many given opportunities. It'll do something really well and make me think, damn, this is actually a freaking awesome horror game. but will then immediately follow that up with something else that has legitimately made me overuse a particular phrase during this game, and that phrase also happens to rhyme with Outlast 2 as well. Of course I'm referring to the saying, "fuck you." I lost count of how many times Outlast 2 raised itself up in my eyes to then instantly do something that made me tell it to go fuck itself. Enemies that instantly kill you, enemies that hang around the only pathway, enemies that seem to gravitate towards your hiding place when they'd have no rhyme or reason to all be walking towards your location at the same time, enemies that will continue to follow you as you move from said location to another one to get away, despite the fact that you haven't even alerted them, enemies that despawn while you're not looking and then spawn near you, and many, many beginner's traps. Now, I usually try to split a rant video into the good and the bad, but both Outlast 2's good and bad are so hand in hand that I'm just gonna have to cover them individually. The setting this time is the deserts of Arizona, where a group of Christian fanatics have set up shop and are all being led by this one guy who's like some sort of prophet, but not, because I swear there's a lot of rape/not rape. We don't really know what's happening going on here. As unsuspecting travellers are being kidnapped and suddenly they have a baby put inside them which is due to be born in like 2 days afterwards. Which isn't how fetal development works, but I've got the feeling that explaining biology to a group of hardcore Christian fanatics would be about as good an idea as becoming a dentist for crocodiles. But after opening up the game in a helicopter, you'll suddenly remember that horror game plus helicopter intro equals helicopter crash, and now your wife has been kidnapped. So now it's time to go on the path of blood and take your revenge with your trusty camcorder and Blake's incessant whimpering. I also never really got why Blake kept recording everything around him when getting the f*** out of Dodge seemed to be it'd be higher up on his list of priorities. But as you make your way through the Arizona desert, which is constantly nighttime for some reason, you'll inevitably realise that any sort of unique atmosphere that this game might have had has been totally stolen by Resident Evil 7. And that's not Outlast 2's fault, mind you, it's just that Resi 7 did it better than Outlast 2. Resident Evil 7 made you rub your face against everything that you could contract a disease off of, and even made you eat some of it. In contrast, Outlast 2 is more along the lines of, oh, there's a pile of dead bodies. Oh, there's someone who's being crucified. The story and atmosphere starts off on a really strong note, but I personally feel that it started to slip as the game goes on until eventually you'll get to the end, pause, and then go, what the f***? Throughout your playthrough, okay, spoiler alert because I'm going to ruin most of this for you, throughout the game, Blake will start seeing hallucinations as well as some other crazy shit. One reoccurring theme is his supposed flashbacks to his elementary school and in particular, his childhood friend Jessica. It is immediately hinted that Jessica committed suicide for whatever reason, but that Blake was somehow responsible. You'll soon realise, however, that these are not flashbacks, but are hallucinations, and as you begin to get more of them, they begin to turn more violent. And as we come across one hallucination after another, we begin to get the impression that these flashbacks of a traumatic childhood memory, and everything that's happening in Arizona is connected. If you're thinking that, then I'm afraid that that was the wrong answer and you've been knocked out of the contest. But before you go home, here's your consolation prize. A dunce hat and a middle finger to take home with you. The dunce hat to let everyone know that you're thick as shit, and the middle finger to remind you to f*** off every time you look at it. Nope! Turns out that these two events are completely unconnected, and that Blake is just tripping balls for some reason. And the further into the game you go, the weirder things get. With plague colonies, prophecies of the Antichrist, the Passion of the Christ now showing in HD, and a baby that took one night to fully develop that may or may not actually be real. Yeah, that's something I never got. I get that Lynn tells Blake that the child wasn't real, but then what did she die of? She was clearly in some sort of discomfort right beforehand, and went through the motions of giving birth, but if there was no baby, then what was she pushing out? Because all I can think of was that she died taking a massive shit. And when Blake is holding the baby in front of her, what he's actually doing is cradling a fresh poo in his arms. That's the only thing that makes sense in my mind. But then again, I'm just as fucked up as this game, so whatevs. Now, in this game's defense, the full explanation of the story is there, and you just need to piece it together yourself. And under normal circumstances, I wouldn't have a problem with this. However, Outlast 2's implementation of this is abysmal. This game takes the how much you become invested in the story depends entirely on the player approach, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, providing of course that you make all of the relevant information at least somewhat accessible to the player. What it should not do, however, is make it so that 9 out of 10 documents which contain vital plot information is either covered in dirt, shite, blood, hard to find, or written in a style of handwriting that is ridiculous to read. There were so many occasions where I'd pick up a document, start reading it, only to then find myself having to stop halfway through because there was a chunk of it that I just couldn't make out. I can't read this. It also didn't help that some of these documents are placed in areas that are swarming with enemies, and I honestly can't recommend going document hunting while an enemy is charging at you with a machete whilst quoting the Book of Revelations. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that this game overdid it with the whole document thing. It kind of detracts from the flow of scares and horrors that this game does really well, when it expects us to drop all of that and read another fucking fake gospel passage, while being stalked by an unstoppable killer. I mean, what is this? Slender the 8 pages? But if you do manage to find every single document in this game, then you have no life. I mean, you'll be able to figure out what's really going on. But I also couldn't stand how this game ended. The story was purposely left unfinished for one of 2 possible reasons. Either to let the player decide for themselves what really happened, which I personally think is a terrible way of ending it, because if you're letting me decide what happened, then I'd probably go with something shit but easy to explain, like Blake is really in a mental hospital eating ice cream and watching Tom and Jerry whilst believing he's in Arizona, and Lynn or Lynette or whatever the fuck his wife is called is really his nurse. Or reason number 2 would be that it's been left open the way it has for future DLC. Which is also a terrible way of ending it, because you're essentially holding the rest of the plot at ransom. Here's the full game at retail price, but if you want to know what happens in the end, then we could be persuaded in telling you. For a nominal fee, that is. Well, Outlast 2, if that is indeed the attitude you're gonna take, then I'm afraid you've been knocked out of the contest. But please accept these consolation prizes of a dunce hat and a middle finger. Thank you for playing. Give them a hand, ladies and gentlemen. You know what, f*** the story, so let's talk more smack and good stuff about this game. The horrors, for example, are so well done here. At least for the first time you encounter one. What really stood out for me with this title was that while the horror takes a while to get going, creating tension and suspense within the player because we haven't experienced anything yet and we know it's coming, it's just a matter of when, and when the horrors do finally start to rear its ugly head, it keeps its head above the parapet for practically the rest of the game with barely any time to recover between each encounter. I think this part of the game will explain what I mean better than I could, but this first part is the end section of a deadly encounter during one of the hallucination sections. I want you to pay attention to what happens next, and how quickly we enter the next encounter. You've got to admit, that was fast. Now, not all of this is chase scenes, as there will be many sections where you have to work your way through an area that's crawling with enemies without getting spotted. These parts are hit and miss, if I'm honest. Some sections work really well, while others are just implemented poorly. When you manage to sneak through a small village without getting spotted, the payoff is satisfying, and makes you feel like a camouflage bad invisible motherfucker. But then there will be other times where you're required to go down this one particular narrow path, but an enemy that can insta-kill you is standing right in the middle of it and won't go away. In other areas, I found that unless you're just naturally lucky, stealth is completely useless. In fact, in one particular area, I managed to get past it by making a mad dash to my objective, then to the next objective, and then all the way back again. Anyone remember that scene from Band of Brothers where that captain runs through the Nazis' lines and then runs all the way back through it again afterwards? It was like that, but at night, in Arizona, and where the Nazis have been replaced with psychopathic Christians. There are also plenty of hiding places about the place, as well as a voice feature on your camera to get a vague idea of where the enemy is, but the enemy AI doesn't always play by the logic rules. Sure, if I turn a corner to a dead end, and all there is to hide in is a barrel in plain sight, and I go and hide in that barrel, then I'm asking to be killed. But turning a corner, barrel rolling into a barn, locking the door, and hiding underneath a cart at the very back of the building, past several other hiding places, should serve as a good hiding spot. What I don't expect is for the enemy to then break down the door, walk straight over to the cart I'm hiding under, and drag me out from there. Do you have X-ray vision or what? And this is where that phrase comes into play. I found that in these sections, I wasn't crapping my pants, I was telling the game to fuck off. I call shenanigans! And beginner's traps are everywhere here. Sections that will kill you unless you know exactly where to go at a moment's notice, as well as knowing to do the most illogical thing in the heat of the moment. I want to show you one section that really took the biscuits, the cake, and a whole Krispy Kreme factory when it comes to below the belt moments. Now this is a section from one of the hallucination levels. In previous levels, I had encountered a demon who's trying to kill me. Now, as I reach the bottom of these stairs, I notice that the demon is materializing in front of me. The problem is that I need to go in that direction, but right now, I can't, because if I do, I'd die. Now, logic dictates that if you can only go up or down, and the route down is blocked off by a demon, then the only option available to you is to go up. So I head up and... Fuck you, Outlast. When I first played this part, I was genuinely at a loss. I paused the game and pondered upon where I'd gone wrong. As said, I had two directions I could take, either up or down. Down was out of the question because an enemy is there, while up was also not on the table for the same reason. But if both my options were not available to me, then how do I get past this point? Well, as it turns out, there is a way past it, but the possibility of someone coming up with it on their first go is about as likely as North Korea deciding to stop snorting crack. Here is how you get past this section. First, you head downstairs until you see the demon appear. Then, start upstairs again, but when you see the other demon, you jump over the railings and down to the ground, at which point, that first demon has despawned for some reason. Oh, okay. Sorry, I actually pronounced that wrong. It's actually pronounced fuck you. And then there's the chase scenes, which are everyone's biggest criticism of this game. I was aware of this issue before going into this game, and to start, I was wondering what everyone's problem was when it came to them. I found that the early ones weren't even that bad, and I was able to get through them first try without any problems. But then the rest of the game happened, and I ended up siding with the majority. Being forced to run for your life on a very tight time frame from enemies that can instantly kill you is nothing new to the genre. One of the most memorable ones for me was in Call of Cthulhu, and if you've played that game then you know exactly the part I'm talking about. These sections demand that the player go through a frantic dash away from pursuing enemies by overcoming obstacles in a very short space of time. Failing will mean that the enemy catches up to you and kills you, forcing you to go back and start the whole thing over again. You'll usually have to run through and lock doors to buy yourself some time, or maybe push a bookcase in front of a door or window, vault over some beams and whatnot, and hiding is out of the question here. The enemies know you're there and will find you if you try to hide, meaning that your only option is to get away from them. Outlast 2 loves these sections with a passion, and there's nothing wrong with that. The problem this game has, however, is that all of the options and strategizing that was present in the first game has been completely removed and instead replaced with only one route and one escape path. To add insult to injury, your escape point is almost always hidden, difficult to find, or completely missable. Though a level may be leading you down a path with some angry Protestants behind you, it's not uncommon to find that all there is at the end of this path is a large inaccessible gate, and when that happens, you're screwed! There's literally nothing you can do because the level encouraged you to go down the wrong way, and heading back will only mean that you'll be instantly killed. Which is the only thing you can do now. And then when you finally do find the exit, it's this really well hidden space underneath a fence that you wouldn't have known unless you were specifically looking for it. It turns these sections into a frustrating trial and error grind, instead of the heart-pounding fight for survival that it should have been. And when enough of all of these factors begin to add up, you find that it's not fear you're feeling, but anger. This game has some bloody good aspects to it, and almost all of the horror is excellent. There's all this other shit that's just bringing it down, and all of this said shit can fuck off. And that's where this game's horror factor fails. A game that nails horror is one of those ones which makes you want to slam your fist down on the escape button and stop playing it because you just can't take the scares anymore. That's the mark of a good horror game, because you are now overcome with fear, and fear can be an enjoyable experience, especially in media format. But if a horror game is pissing you off more than it's scaring you, then anger is the dominant emotion here, and anger is a very effective weapon against fear. It's a form of defiance, that whatever's scaring you is not in control, and thus does not have any power over you. You cease to feel hopeless and realise that you have the means to fight back. So when an unkillable enemy suddenly teleports around the corner, I'm not shitting myself, because what I'm actually doing is turn this game to fuck off for pulling such a cheap cheat on me, and thus, I'm not afraid and the horror fails. One last thing before we finish this off, I've noticed something that no one else has seemed to have picked up on, and it's when Blake puts his glasses back on. You know how in some films and shows, a character will slowly put on a pair of sunglasses to make emphasis on how badass they are, especially if they've just done something cool? Well, when Blake puts his glasses back on after he's been knocked off of a cliff or whatever, the animation looks slightly slower than what most people would actually do, making it look like he's trying to be all badass and shit, and I just thought that it looked funny. Nailed it. In conclusion, Outlast 2 is definitely worth playing if you like horror games. It's one of the most intense horrors of recent days, and feels like a non-stop terror-inducing rollercoaster at times. The atmosphere is incredible, and some of the cutscenes are unbelievable too. Like, seriously, in one scene you get crucified. Never had that happen to me in a video game before, so kudos to Outlast 2 for introducing me to such a morbid experience. But on the flip side, be prepared for a what the fuck story, a lot of trial and error chase scenes, a lot of below the belt moments, and characters who aren't really that good. I'd recommend that you do what I did and wait for this game to go on sale before getting it, but don't let most of what I talked about in this video put you off. It's a lot like trying to teach a dog to talk. It has some inherent problems and may infuriate you at times, but the payoff is sweet.
Watch this.
Shock horror, I know. What seems to me is that Outlast 2 doesn't... Motherfucker.
Sometimes this life is killing me. I swear sometimes I think